Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host, she's the middle child, Leanne Hughes.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Leanne Hughes, and I'm here to help you create unpredictable workshop experiences that predictably work. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode. Last week, we had Daniel Kerr from Exceptional Self-Coaching on the show, tackling a conversation around mindset and how we can start small in 2021 to finish strong. So I love conversations. It's the reason why I have an interview-style podcast. I just love them. If I could just get paid to have morning coffees with people and then turn that into afternoon champagnes by the water, do that all day, every day, that would be the ultimate goal. What's interesting about that, though, is I'm not the best at small talk. I can do it. I absolutely will do it at advanced networking, but I don't love going to the dog park. I'm thrilled that my dogs love playing there, but the conversation and chitter chatter at a dog park with the dog party crew generally just seems to be about our dogs, like their age, what they eat, their habits. And honestly, I'd rather talk about something a little more juicy. And look, I can probably take not some blame for it, but I'm not there initiating juicy and deep conversations just because of the context, right? You're meeting up with strangers in a dog park. It's the common denominator, so start with that. But today's guest, well, I think we'd get along just fine if we were at a dog park together, because his tagline is, let's have conversations that matter. Yes, please. His name's Jan Keck, and he's a self-proclaimed community addict. He's the creator of Ask Deep Questions, which started out as a deck of cards to help his friends connect on a camping trip, and is now being used to facilitate meaningful conversations through sharing personal stories on every continent around the globe. Now, when you do have conversations that matter, you may be going into territory that may be uncomfortable, a little bit awkward. So how do you create, then hold that space when it happens? It's a question I asked Jan. Listen in to find out more. Jan's mission is to help people feel less alone. So by creating experiences, workshops, and programs, he's fueling the movement for deeper human connection. Jan grew up as an only child, and he found his soul family at summer camp, in sports clubs, and even politics. But when he moved from Germany to Canada in his 20s, he had to recreate his community from scratch, and he learned that the fastest way to make deep connections is through meaningful conversations and experiences. And that's why I'm geeking out on Clubhouse at the moment, because I found people there that want to talk about really deep, interesting things. Back to Jan. He lives in Toronto with his wife, Natalia, his son, Micah, and you can often find him hanging out with his mastermind group, attending community events, or camping up north. You can check out what Jan does over at askdeepquestions.com and jankeck.com. That's spelled Jankek. I will pop a link to that in the show notes. In this conversation, we chat about relationships and which ones we invest in. If it's possible to create a sense of belonging in an organization, that's what all the companies want. We want it to be inclusive. How do we do that? We dive into chats about redesigning virtual calls, scaling connections online, and also, by the way, Jan has a kick butt YouTube channel. So he shares his tips for camera confidence, as well as advice for first-time facilitators. Don't forget, if you're listening in Jan 2021, the listener survey is up and running for another 2 weeks. Please, please, please jump in. I'm really seriously taking on board your feedback, your thoughts, your ideas to reignite, reshape, rejuvenate this show. Head on over to firsttimefacilitator.com/say to participate. And of course, when the show is over, join our community of over 1,200 facilitators, including Jan, on our free Facebook group called The Flip Chart. If you'd like to support my daily caffeine and ideation sessions, head on over to buymeacoffee.com/Leanne Hughes. Now, link to everything mentioned in the show, as well as Jan's contact details, can be over at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 156. Now, onto the show. I'm super excited to welcome onto the First Time Facilitator podcast, Jan Keck. Jan, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm super excited to be here.
We have been connected on Instagram, YouTube, the flip chart. So we're finally having a real life conversation, which is amazing. And Jan, I know a bit about your story because I have been consuming some of your content. But for those who don't know who you are, can you please share a bit of your story with them?
Sure. I think with everyone's story, I feel like there's so many different journeys and so many different ways of even like starting to tell or answer that question. I feel like it's, which direction do I want to go in? And I think that the part that I'm the most passionate about right now is helping people feel less alone. And that's kind of been my mission for the last few years. And especially in 2020, there's a lot more people that need to have the tools and need to have these experiences that help them feel more connected to each other, where we can't physically be present in a lot of cases. And we have to use technology, which I have this love-hate relationship with, which we can maybe go into in a little bit later. But we really have to be more intentional on how can we use this technology to connect with each other and how can we really be present with each other.
I find that really interesting as well, because you see a lot of the time on all these community boards when people are talking about the conversation is a lot about the tech, like which microphone, which video. I saw a really great there's a guy called Dave Jackson. He's a podcasting coach. He put this infographic up and he goes, spend $100 on your microphone and spend 100 hours thinking about your audience and what they need. And I think, that sums up, I think, the whole virtual facilitation world as well. But just to build on your point of connection and loneliness, you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of ways to connect, yet we still feel alone. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think there's different layers of feeling connection with someone else or with a group. And I grew up in Germany and then I moved to Canada now 13, 14 years ago. And when I moved here, I literally didn't know a single person. Actually, that's not true. I knew one person, an acquaintance, a exchange student who was from Canada and came to Germany, and we had some conversations and I crashed on her couch for the first few days until I figured out my apartment situation. But I literally had to rebuild my whole network, my whole circle of friends once I arrived here. And the first few years, probably, I would join different communities. Couch surfing was one of them where I found a lot of people with similar interests because none of us really were from Canada. We all were like travelers, visitors. But the problem with that community was that most people then left and I stayed. So the connections weren't necessarily there for the long term. And at one point, I just realized, I think I'm just collecting like business cards and LinkedIn connections and Facebook friends, but do I have some real friends that I can show up in the middle of the night with a bottle of wine and say, hey, we need to chat about something that is going on in my life? And they would actually let me in. That's kind of my definition a little bit of a close friend. How many people do you have in your life that you could do that with?
Yeah, actually, good point. I was actually at an event last night, sort of reflecting on this whole connection thing and the fact that I'm actually spending a lot more time with people I've never met in person. And I have a really great connection with them, people I've never met before, just through this year, than I have with my own friends in the physical world. And we're allowed to meet now. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe what does that say about my priorities? Very brave of you to go to a new country and to start life again. When you are trying to build connections, so if you got someone, I guess I have a friend from the US that moved to Brisbane, and in his first year, he just said yes to every invitation that was offered to him. That was his strategy. What are your strategies for making new friends and trying to figure out, like, is it worth investing in? Or, yeah, it's tough to know sometimes.
Yeah, and I would say that I've approached it very differently when I first came to Canada. And I actually also spent a year traveling in Australia, which is kind of where I spent the first time in my life completely doing solo travel. I worked all kinds of different jobs and basically made my schedule every day. And the same thing that happened there, that I thought I can apply to moving to Canada, is connecting with other travelers, because we have so many things in common. But if you're staying in one place, those were not the best people to connect to. And after years and years later, I've actually attended this one experience, this one weekend retreat that kind of changed my whole life. That was also the start of this new business, where I saw a Facebook post in a group, and all I remember it said was, let's go outside of the city. I'm like, yes, let's get away from technology. Let's get out in nature and let's work on our goal setting for the year. At that time, I had a business in video production, and me and my business partner, we said, let's go and work on our plan for our business, setting goals for the next year. Turns out it was a personal goal setting retreat. So we didn't spend any time talking about business. And for the first time in my life, I set personal goals for the year of like, how do I want my relationships to look like? How do I want my health to improve? How do I want my finances to look like? If I had to figure out what does a level 10 life look like, I had to like draw that all out. And at the end of that weekend, I had this almost like spiritual experience where I was looking around the room and everybody was saying goodbye and hugging each other, where I could literally feel the energy vibrating in the room. And I often describe it as if you've ever watched the Care Bears that shoot the rainbows out of their bellies.
Yeah.
That's what I was imagining when I was looking around the room. Everybody was shooting energy out of their chests around the room. And at that point, I realized that's what I want more of, but I didn't know what it was until later. I realized that was just feeling this complete sense of belonging, because everybody accepted me for who I was. I didn't have to change who I was. I didn't have to pretend to be someone. Like, I walked in there with other people that have been doing self-development, and I said, well, I've never done, like, this is completely brand new to me. And I didn't feel like I needed to pretend that I'm an expert at it. So that became kind of this moment where I decided, okay, I want more of that. Let's re-engineer what happened and how can I get more of that?
I love those moments. When I talk to facilitators as well about like choosing this as a career, it usually boils down to like this workshop where something happened or you saw someone do something, you think, I want to be part of that. I want to create that experience. And I'm just laughing because you went to that retreat thinking it was a business one. It's funny when you have your own business, you're so focused on the business and you're like, life is important too. But so it really kind of shifted those priorities for you. So what did you do then? So you're like, right, I want to create this experience. You're in video production. What was your next step?
Well, I knew that I wanted to have these types of relationships, these types of conversations that I had that weekend more. And when I re-engineered it, the things that made us connect so quickly and so deeply at that weekend was like 2 or 3 things. One was we all came together on shared values in terms of self-development, self-growth. That was kind of what brought us together. And although I thought it was a business retreat, I realized that actually was a huge value of mine. And we immediately just hit it off. And I sometimes describe it as we're kind of going towards the same direction. Like we're heading to the same destination, rather than what I did before with like the couch surfing, looking for people who've had a shared history or like we came from the same place, but we might not be going in the same direction. So with those people, we're all like heading towards like we want to improve our lives, we want to improve ourselves. And then the second thing that happened, which became the main part of my work now, is we had these really deep, vulnerable conversations with each other where we shared the things that we always wanted to tell someone, but we never really had the courage to. And we just felt safe in that space to explore these things. And it was easy. It wasn't scary. And to me, that just was so foreign. I never was a fan of small talk, but having the opportunity to have these conversations, I realized, this is what a good conversation is like. Why don't I have more of those at the networking events that I attend to, where I just exchange business cards with people that I probably will never follow up with?
Yeah, or why does it take like a bottle of wine for that to happen? You know, like sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like I say, I love that you're sort of engineering it. Interesting that you spoke about the direction that you're heading in rather than where you're from. And I heard a good quote on a podcast this morning, actually, and it was, sometimes we order off yesterday's menu. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. It's like, so I think that's what you're talking about is you're making connections, new connections based on what had been yesterday's menu, but you're looking at right today and looking forward. What does that look like? I'm curious about the word belonging. I know like it's such a corporate word now, like companies, like we want people to feel like they belong here. Do you think that's possible? I mean, at least until, companies have shared values, right? So it's on paper. Is it possible to create what you had at that retreat in an organization?
I think it's very hard when people don't necessarily self-select to attend like an experience. And I've had this in my own workshops where some of my workshops are public and individuals come and like I take them on this journey, but they know from the beginning they're going to be vulnerable, we're going to have deep conversations, and you're probably going to be uncomfortable. And they say, yes, I want that. And then they come. If you work with an organization and the HR manager hires you, people don't necessarily have the option to opt in. They have the option to go as deep as they feel comfortable. That's kind of how I like to reframe it. There's the concept of like challenge by choice. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the idea of you choose how deep you want to go. You choose your type of challenge. Like I'm not going to ask you to, let's say, all jump from the 10-meter board into the pool. I'm going to ask you to jump into the pool. And you choose, do you want to put your feet in first and then maybe just like slide in? Or do you want to go to the highest tower and jump in? You choose. As long as we're all ending up in the water at the end, we're going to have this shared moment, this shared experience.
That's such a powerful metaphor. As a facilitator, when you're dealing with people that are talking about things that are uncomfortable, how do you manage that? Do you feel uncomfortable? How do you personally deal with the stuff that would come up in your workshops?
The big thing that I've learned is if you set up the right container and the right atmosphere with a group, it's not my responsibility anymore to hold up that space. Like, it's the group's responsibility. So I spend, especially if there's any deeper work, I spend a lot more time creating community agreements to make sure that we're all on the same page. If there is more time, I would even ask people, like, what do you need to feel supported to be vulnerable in this next hour or two? And if everybody agrees to that in the beginning, it will make it so much easier once we go there. And the other thing I've learned, especially virtually, is if you realize that somebody needs more time to debrief, because oftentimes you're like joining a Zoom call and then the experience is over and suddenly everybody's screen goes blank and they're by themselves again.
Yeah.
And in person, that doesn't really happen. Like, you're still like people, you're wrapping up your equipment, you're packing things up. People still might be chatting with you, chatting with each other, maybe grabbing a drink or dinner after with somebody that you've just met. But online, we're just like, no, the event is over and that's it. So I started just hanging out, like planning that into my schedule of hanging out at the end of the event for at least 15, 20 minutes. And yesterday I attended an event that I helped put together and we stayed at an hour. Like, it was an evening event already. It was 7 till 10 p.m. And we stayed until 11 p.m. of just people sharing.
Wow, that's cool. So you've actually embedded the hangout part as part of the agenda, so people know. And then it's also okay if you don't want to stick around, you can just leave.
Actually, people don't know. I don't tell them that it's happening. I just do it like at the end. Like, I close the event and then I just offer anybody who wants to hang out. I still have 20 minutes or so. Just have some more conversations.
Yeah, because it does feel weird. Another community call I held a couple of weeks ago, sort of like wrapped it up and it was nice, and then we said goodbye and I clicked that red button and then you're like, huh. And I went for a walk after it and I was like, I didn't feel closure on it. So I kind of just got WhatsApp out and I was like just sending voice notes to the people, just saying, hey, thanks for this. I reflected on this. And I thought that was a nice way of like kind of closing it off, like keeping it going without being on the call. Because I needed that myself. Like, I needed that just to say thank you. We don't often talk about the end. We always talk about the beginning and, creating that space and the environment. So you got some great questions that you use on your virtual calls. Have you shifted much? If you are watching this on YouTube, you'll see Jan's incredible video set up in his background and his lighting. It's just so pro. So you kind of 2020, this is where you're sort of hitting your straps, I think, because, you've got all the setup. What have you found moving to virtual this year?
So I was very hesitant moving anything to virtual. Like, everything for me was in person. I did use Zoom for like mastermind calls and like group coaching, but only because the people were not local, because I work with people anywhere, but they were spread across North America mostly. And we could not do something in person. So I said, okay, Zoom is the best place to be. But when the pandemic happened, like, I'm just looking for this thing that I usually tell everyone, let's turn this off as soon as we start in the event. I'm holding up my cell phone for anybody who's listening. Yeah. And let me show you something else. And I'll describe it for you, for anyone who's listening, but you might hear. I have this envelope that also is a cell phone sleeping bag. So sometimes at the beginning of my events, as like an activity when people arrive, is you get to customize your little envelope.
I love that.
And then we all put our cell phones inside, seal it up, and that way we can make sure that we're not distracted. We can be present with each other. And then 2020 happened, and suddenly we have to use our phones, our computers to connect with each other. And I just said, it's not possible. Like, how do I know that if you're actually looking at me or if you're checking emails? I can't tell. Unless you're wearing glasses and I can see the reflection in your eyes, or it's really dark and suddenly your light gets a lot brighter because you're opening up Gmail. Like, those are the only clues you get, but you can't really tell. And I find that really hard to still feel connected to someone that way.
I see you're so active on YouTube and in the flip chart, like just sharing all the tips for how you're creating that space. What's worked for you now that, okay, maybe it is possible to do this virtual thing? How have you had to like really reshape and redesign your experiences, or have you sort of just translated it and just popped it onto a Zoom call?
I think what I'm doing on a Zoom call is very different and very similar to what I did in person. Very different in the way we're using kind of engagement tools and the way we communicate with each other, but very similar in terms of the structure. I'm sorry for all the people who are just listening. I'm like holding up lots of objects because that's actually, we'll talk about this later, but one of my favorite things to do in virtual calls is do things with objects because that's what we can't do in person. Like we can't just like, hey, grab something that has holes in it, grab something that you can look through and hold it up in the camera. Like that's one of my favorite activities.
Yeah.
But I'm holding up a log because I have this metaphor, this campfire formula that I use when I'm building experiences. And the idea is that you can't hold up a lighter to a big log and expect it to catch fire. You have to first light something like paper, and then you add your little sticks and your kindling, and then by the end you add your big log. For anybody who's been camping and knows how to start a fire, that might sound familiar. And the same way I'm designing my experiences in a way that you ask for these micro engagements in the beginning. You ask people to do something that is not very scary, that is very easy to do, like, hey, answer a question in the chat that only takes you 10 seconds to think about your answer. And then by the end, once we've created that space and asked a little bit more each round, each time, that's where we can go to the more deeper, vulnerable stuff. And I don't know if you saw, I have to stop holding up so many things, but I'm holding up some cards that I created. They're called Ask Deep Questions cards, and they have these 3 levels of curious and then brave and then vulnerable questions. And it's the same principle of like, let's talk about things that are deeper than small talk, but easy to answer. And once we feel comfortable as a group or as two partners doing these questions, then let's move to the next deeper level. And then the vulnerable questions, I usually only offer once you've had like at least half an hour or more time to have a conversation, because those are questions I define as things you've never answered before.
What would be an example of a vulnerable question?
Which category would you like one?
So let's go vulnerable. Go each one. Go each one. That'd be good. Yeah.
So I picked up 3 random cards.
Yeah.
So I did not choose them before. The curious one is, what are you most grateful for in your life? So something that, like, not your usual small talk question, but you could probably find an answer pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Brave question is, if you could relive a moment of your life, which one would you pick?
I love it.
And then vulnerable would be, how do you want to be remembered?
Ah, wow. Yeah, I can absolutely understand the 3 different layers.
Yeah, holding up the lighter to the big log would be, first conversation happening would be, hey, how do you want to be remembered? And most people would go like, I don't know how much I want to share with this person. This feels uncomfortable. But if you create this trust, this psychological safety through the first, let's say 20, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, depending on the size of the group and the dynamics, that's where you can go to places like that.
Oh, that's brilliant. And put a link to all of that in the show notes as well, to your cards. I'm curious, you mentioned a discussion point around scaling connections. And sometimes in our lives, like, we might feel like we're tapped out. We've got like so many connections and we're not even like nurturing the ones that we need to. And so how do we, I'm curious about that term, scaling connections, like online and offline. I'm just curious, like, what did you mean by that term? And like, what are some strategies to sort of being able to handle the amount of connections and actually being a good reciprocator on those as well?
Yeah, it's interesting how you defined that term very differently to what I was imagining when I wrote it.
Right.
And I probably didn't give a lot of descriptions to it, but what I understood with scaling connections is more in the terms of, if you have a group that you're facilitating with and you want to make them feel connected with maybe like 3-4 people, it's easy to do. But what if you had like 50, 60, 100, 200, 300 people? How can you still make them feel connected to each other? And experience this many times, that if you join a Zoom call with like 100 other people and you're just like one small thumbnail in like a few pages on Zoom, you feel very insignificant. You don't feel like you're heard or seen, especially if you can't unmute yourself. Maybe chat is not even enabled. The person's just broadcasting their message, kind of webinar style. You're not feeling connected. Even though there's other people there, you don't feel connected to them either. So when it comes to scaling connections, I'm thinking, okay, how can we do something that works for small groups, but also large groups? And the main tool that I use is breakout rooms, because in breakout rooms, we can have those small group discussions. And that's really what helps people feel connected to each other. And I found some really cool research on the bystander effect.
Yeah, I
The
love
term
that.
might not be familiar to everyone, but the study that they did is somebody faked a heart attack in a subway car. And if the subway car only has a few people in it, then they're more likely to jump in and help. If it's really crowded, like the more people are on the subway car, the less likely one person is jumping up and helping, because there's this distribution of responsibility. If everybody's responsible, nobody feels responsible. And that's kind of what happens when you have a group of even like 20, 30 people on a Zoom call and you ask a question and you just ask someone to share. Again, in person, you would just walk up to someone or make eye contact so they know they're supposed to share something. On Zoom, that doesn't really work. So oftentimes you just get silence and crickets. But if you put people in a breakout room with like 3 or 4 people, then that responsibility is much bigger for each person individually. So they're more likely to share something. And that's what I talk about when it comes to scaling connections. It really happens in those small groups. And the more you can give that small group very clear instructions in terms of like facilitated conversations, hey, here's your question. You all have each person has 2 minutes to answer. The person whose name comes first in the alphabet starts.
Yeah.
Like there's no time wasted in chit chat and small talk. Right away, you're in your conversation. You're getting to the deep, meaningful stuff and not the small talk. Yeah,
I agree. And I always add, before you come back, like maybe nominate some person to be the spokesperson for your group. Or I wonder what that magic number is, where it's like, is it 7, where you got 7 people and you'll always get someone responding, like and then it goes to 8 and then no one responds. Like, I wonder what it is. Be curious maybe we should put a poll out and figure out what that is. Because I think 7 is a good number. And then anything above that, it's like, as you said, just crickets. And I've been on a call with like hundreds of people and they put us into a breakout room. But with that many people as well, I didn't feel like I belonged in that. It was interesting. Maybe because the people that I was broken into, we just didn't share what you talked about before, that same sort of direction of where we wanted to go. So that was an interesting experience as well. When COVID hit, I was just signing up for every webinar in the world and just joining in just to see what was going on and how other people were running events. Let's talk about your video production because of the virtual game and what you're doing with YouTube as well, is that you're teaching a lot of these skills on your channel. Everyone's saying it's like the key skill of the moment is video and being comfortable on it. How did you develop your confidence in front of a camera?
By being in front of the camera, short answer.
There you
because
go. Yeah.
I used to be the person who loves to be behind the camera. Like even growing up, I would be the person who takes pictures of everyone, but whenever somebody points a camera at me, I would duck, I would like hide, I would cover my face. You couldn't catch me. So I was totally comfortable being the person taking the photo, but not the one in the center of attention. And I think that being center of attention was really the main challenge I had to overcome for myself, because I was so uncomfortable with even like speaking in front of people. It's challenging. And I think that there's a few things when I was growing up that got me over that. But the one thing that I might say was the most impactful was taking improv classes. And especially one activity that to this day makes me cringe and uncomfortable when even thinking about it, which is, as a group, you're making up a song and each person sings one line. And singing is not my strength. Singing in front of other people, even worse, singing in front of other people without knowing the melody or what I'm supposed to say. And then hopefully it's also funny, or at least getting the story to continue. There was just so much pressure. It was like nerve-wracking for me. And like you could see people going through one by one, and then it always lands. And for the first few times, it always landed on me to come up with the chorus, like the one line that gets repeated a couple of times. And I would never come up with something good. But it helped me get more comfortable with that situation, just having to do it and having to do it over and over again. And then when it came to being on camera, it was that improviser's mentality that I think helped me just get away from perfectionism. I think that's really the other issue that was there, of thinking, okay, it has to be perfect. I need to say my line perfectly. And the challenging thing is, if you record rather than doing it live, you will do like 20, 30, 40 takes until you get it right. And now I'm just doing it live and I don't really care so much anymore about it being perfect. And that's just so liberating.
It is. What you're talking about is very parallel to my experience being a first-time facilitator. Like I would literally rehearse the way that I'd introduce a model or rehearse how I'd introduce an activity when I was a first-time facilitator. And I love that there's absolutely an element in there about perfectionism and we often, we do shine the spotlight harder on ourselves than anyone else. And I definitely find for Virtually Possible, I had to do like a module, and right up front, I'm like, this is going to be a one-take wonder and I'm not going to stop. And even just having that mentality of like, you might pause or stuff up a word. And if you are recording it, you just stop and go, I'll do it again. But then if you just keep pushing through, it becomes so much easier. And I just love that whole just shift of you've actually just got to do it first and the courage will follow. I mean, you're friends with me too.
It took a long time.
That's very reassuring. Really?
So my videos looked great, but my performance in front of the camera, horrible. The first video that I edited of myself, I wanted to edit everything out. And there was nothing left.
Is it still on YouTube?
It's still on YouTube, my first professionally edited video. And it actually is not as bad as it was in my head. But like you said, we're our own worst critic. And when you're uncomfortable when you're being filmed, when you watch yourself back, you see yourself being uncomfortable. And that's the worst. Like nobody wants to see you in that state. So the big thing that needs to change is you need to fall in love with what you're doing in front of the camera. You need to have fun. You need to make the process fun. And then whatever you do, even if you stumble over your words and if you say a lot, at least you don't look at yourself being uncomfortable. You look at yourself having fun, and it gets so much easier. But yeah, the first years of doing videos was very scripted, of reading or memorizing a sentence, a paragraph at a time, stopping, and then editing it all together. So it was a lot of work.
A lot of time, yeah. And I can imagine your process now is a bit more fluid and natural. Isn't it funny? We were talking about like the worst advice you've been given a night. People saying, just be yourself. It's actually kind of hard to be yourself.
Mm-hmm. The just is the hard part. Yeah, just be yourself. Like it's so easy.
Yeah. It comes back to the whole belonging thing. And I even remember when, because I was working for a company a couple of years ago, and it was like, we want everyone to be themselves at work. But it's like, do you really want that? Like, if I was really myself, you'd probably hear a lot of things that I'm masking because I, don't agree with certain things. But I don't know if that is really what they want. So, so in terms of your personal prep, I'm curious how you, before a Zoom call, before one of your workshops, how do you personally prepare, like get into your facilitation state?
For me, music is a big, big part of it. I start every call usually with music. Sometimes even when I'm meeting someone for the first time for like a one-on-one conversation, I just have the music still playing while they join and then fade it out, which makes them smile as well. But yeah, I use music to pump myself up and then also to make everyone else feel a little bit more welcome when they come in. And finding that right track is sometimes hard depending on the type of vibe that you want to create. And maybe that is also a bit vulnerable because I'm sharing the music that I like to listen to, and maybe other people don't like it. Yeah. But so far, I've been quite lucky with the selections that I have.
Any favorites?
So that's definitely one.
Any go-to songs? I'm assuming we're not talking Metallica.
No, not that. Although a lot of times, if it can get you a laugh, or people like, "Ooh, that sounds really interesting. What is that?" Like I just played a Billy Joel ragtime song, like piano playing really fast and like up and down, and it's just like, and I turned it into an activity the other day where I just asked, okay, if you had to name the song, what would you call it? Type it in the chat as like the first thing as the people are coming in, because it was one of those songs that you can't ignore it. It's not a background song. It's like so
the main event,
on there, yeah.
That's a really cool question. Where do you get your inspiration? Like, where do these ideas pop up from? Is it just innate to you, or do you look for great questions?
I think it's a lot of different places. That specific one, I didn't have something planned and I needed something. And
yes.
It just in the moment, I'm like, somebody commented on the song, and then I said, well, what would you call it if you had to name it? It's having fun with it, I think, is the big part. Like I have something where maybe it's a bit hindering at times, but I need to keep things fresh for myself. So even though that I've maybe run a workshop exactly the way it's perfect and it worked really well, I would change it up so it keeps it interesting for myself. And when I'm right now teaching a lot of facilitators how to create more engaging online experiences, I just tell them from the beginning, hey, every time I'm going to try something that I've never done before, and then we'll see if it works. And if it works, you can copy it. If it doesn't work, then you know that you shouldn't use it. Yeah. And both of us, or everybody, takes so much away from it, of having that group of people where you can experiment and you don't have to worry if it fails.
Yeah, actually, that's why I like the title of my podcast being First Time Facilitator. It's not too much pressure, because every time, I think one of my guests, Tim Ferguson, before episode 100, he was saying every time you step up, you're a first time facilitator because of the new audience and, things that just, we're all having that mindset of just trying and experimenting. And I think that's the way that I've grown in this virtual accelerator the last sort of 6 months, is just by every time we're jumping on a call, trying something different. I actually love that you play music, even just for one-on-one calls. I think that's neat. Very cool idea. Do you have any advice for first-time facilitators, Jan, just on talking about that group of people? What would you say to yourself? Like, you've come through a big sort of stage of getting uncomfortable, and improv has helped you.
Yeah, one thing I wrote down before this call is the whole idea of presence over perfection. That is the one thing that I had to remind myself a lot in the first few times facilitating or running events. And especially if you're running events where individuals sign up, and the last few days before you're realizing, oh my God, I didn't sell enough tickets. It's going to be only like 4 people. And I was expecting there to be like 40. What do I do? And you start stressing about all the people that didn't make it. And I needed to learn and kind of tell myself, no, what if I focus on the 4 people that are there? What if I create the best experience for them and forget about everyone else? And just be present with them and be present with what they need, and maybe even forget the things that I have planned. And maybe that talks a bit about my process too. I usually plan out everything and then I improvise. So I go through my plan, and then depending on what we need, I might skip things or move the order around or bring in something else. But I need that organization or that preparation so I can feel confident that
Me too.
I have something. But yeah, then the being present part is really, tuning in. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And I've learned this the hard way when I prepared everything and then I left my notes at home. And I had to improvise everything because I needed to figure out, remember what I wanted to do, and I couldn't. So I just had to go with the flow. And at the end, I think it was a better experience than the previous one.
Yeah, I've got the same process as you. It's like, I need to get a good night's sleep. I need to know that I've prepared for it. But then in the moment, absolutely go, you don't need this. Let's move on to something else. And, you're sensing the energy. So bringing in something in the moment. That's awesome. That's an awesome tip. Jan, if our listeners would love to reach out to you and connect more, we could definitely talk for longer, but you got so much awesome stuff on the interwebs. Where should we send people?
The easiest place that also is the easiest to remember is askdeepquestions.com, because that will link to my cards directly, but also that's my personal website, and you can find all the other social media links from there, like YouTube channel, Instagram, and Facebook is the 3 places that I'm probably the most active.
Awesome. askdeepquestions.com. It's a very compelling domain name. I love it.
With my name being Jan, and if I told you jankeck.com, most people would not know how to pronounce it or how to spell it. So Ask Deep Questions is easier. Yeah, definitely. Easier to remember.
Good little sort of launch pad for everything else. Be sure to connect with Jan, check out his stuff on YouTube. And if you are listening to the conversation, hop onto YouTube and just see the way that he set up his gear. It looks really cool, the guitar in the background. It's an interesting background. The lighting's great. But it's also been awesome chatting to you. And as we spoke about, it's more of the design rather than the tech that matters. And thank you for sharing some great questions that you ask, how you create that safety and the whole scaling connections piece. Thank you for clarifying that for me. We've all been that person on the 100-person call, so it's nice to hear your approach to that. It's been awesome chatting to you, Jan. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Hey, thanks so much for sticking around. You've reached the end of another episode of the First Time Facilitator podcast. Connect with the show at firsttimefacilitator.com or follow me on Instagram at Leanne Hughes to find out what I'm up to during the week. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with someone who will also appreciate the insight, and make it easier for yourself and subscribe to the show in your podcast player of choice. Thank you so much for listening, and chat to you next week.